Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the BSI Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 186, Upon the Turf.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became astronomer.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street Irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello there, and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And are you at the starting post, Burt?
Not only am I at the starting post, but I've got my straw hat on and a mint julep in both hands.
Oh, I like that. Although it isn't straw hat season yet, is it?
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. That's not until, when is Straw Hat Day? Is that May 15th?
I believe, yeah.
Yep.
Well, that's okay. We'll cut you some slack and let you sip your julep in peace. Meanwhile, if folks would like to pour yourself a mint julep and pull up a chair, the show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/ihose186, all lowercase. You can leave us a comment there. Of course, you can also email us at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. You can find us on the social networks as I Hear of Sherlock on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And we would welcome your audio comment if you would care to give us one. We will have an audio comment from a listener at the end of the show, so stay tuned for that. And you can do that by dialing 774-221-READ. That's 774-221-7323. Or there's an alternative way. If you'd like to just speak into the audio app on your phone and then email us that as an attachment, we'd be happy to receive your comment that way as well. Once again, we delve into the archives of the BSI Press. There's a brand new book out called Upon the Turf, Horse Racing and the Sherlockian Canon, edited by Candace J. Lewis, Ira Brad Matetsky, and Roger Donway. We are lucky enough to have two of those editors with us in this episode. Let's start with Candace J. Lewis, BSI, who's invested as a Little Art Jargon, is a recently invested member of the BSI. She was the woman of the BSI in 2007. And Candy received her PhD in art history from New York University's Institute of Fine Arts and has worked as an art historian in the field of early Chinese art with a secondary area of specialty in 19th century art in Europe and America. She's been a member of the Hudson Valley Scientists of Dutchess County, New York since 1977, along with her husband, Lou Lewis. Lou actually served as the president of the organization for about 30 years or so, and Candy, in turn, has acted as the program chair. So we see who does the real work there. She edited 3 previous books in conjunction with the running of the Silver Blaze weekends at the Saratoga racetrack for the BSI. It was in 2009, 2012, and 2015. And the most recent was Saratoga at the Rail, from Silver Blaze to Shoscombe Old Place, co-edited with Roger Donway. And we also welcome Ira Brad Matetsky, BSI, who's invested as the final problem. He's a New York City area Sherlockian whose interests include law and the Canon, publication and bibliographical history of the Canon, Sherlockian society history and traditions, and Doylean and Sherlockian poetry. His articles have appeared in the BSJ, the Serpentine Muse, the Watsonian, and several Scion publications, as well as the BSI Press book Canon Law. He's a member of the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, the Sons of the Copper Beeches, and Mrs. Hudson's Cliff Dwellers. He co-edited and contributed to the Sherlock Holmes-themed editions of the Green Bag Almanac and Reader for 2015 and 2016, and is a contributor to the Baker Street Almanac. His other detective fiction activities include serving since 2007 as the Werowance, the president of the Wolff Pack. That's the literary society for the Nero Wolfe novels by Rex Stout, who himself was also at BSI. And Ira is a litigation partner at Ganfer, Shore, Leeds, and Zauderer LLP in Manhattan. Candy and Ira, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, if we are correct in our assumptions, this is a first time for each of you on the show. Is that correct?
Yes.
And yes.
All right.
Here as well.
Let's kick this off then, shall we? Candy, why don't we start with you, ladies first, after all. How did you first discover Sherlock Holmes, and tell us a little bit about how he became more a part of your life over the years?
Oh, thank you for asking. That's a delightful question. Actually, that's a question that we ask all the people in our Scion. And it seems everybody has an answer to that. I always feel quite stupid when we get the answers to that, because it seems as if everyone was introduced themselves to Sherlock Holmes at least by the time they were 10 or 11 years old. I, however, did not really become aware of Sherlock Holmes until I was a college student and was supposed to be doing my assignments, and I don't know how, had a Sherlock Holmes book in my room, and I started reading the stories, and I couldn't stop. So I must have been 18 years old, 17 or 18 years old, and I just loved them. And then I put them down for a while, and an encounter with a certain gentleman whom you all know, a fellow by the name of Judge Albert Rosenblatt, brought my husband Lou Lewis and me into his fold, and that would have been in the mid-1970s. And he said, you have to come and join us. We have these parties, and we like Sherlock Holmes, and you're going to like it too. And so we started going. And that was, how we got back to Sherlock Holmes again.
That's great. Now,
your turn.
I'm curious, though, Candy, how did that book end up in your dorm room?
I don't recall. Sorry, I don't remember.
It may have been a plant.
I don't remember. I just remembered that I loved it.
That's great.
I don't remember.
Now, Ira, how about you? When did you first run into Sherlock Holmes, and how did this momentum build on your end?
I may have had, at the beginning at least, a little bit of the more stereotypical Sherlockian introduction, as Candy suggests. I was in, I believe, 6th grade in Meadow Elementary School in Baldwin, New York, and our 6th grade reading teacher decided that we were going to spend a year focused on Victorian literature, we read A Christmas Carol by Dickens, and we read some Stevenson, and we read some Gilbert and Sullivan, and we read The Red-Headed League. And I enjoyed The Red-Headed League. I remember doing an oral report on it, and the teacher suggesting that I read the entire adventures. So I read the entire adventures at the age of 11 or 12. Don't know whether I understood them all, but I read them all. And Sherlock Holmes became part of my life, not an everyday part of my life, but something I was aware of. I remember reading a couple of stories in high school and college and law school. What I didn't have yet, what I had not yet done, was discovered or become a participant in the organized Sherlockian community. You'll hear people say they didn't know that it was out there. I always knew it was out there. At either college or law school, I saw, I was given a copy of Baring Gould, and I read it. And so I knew that there was this whole organized Sherlockian world out there and what the BSI was and so forth. But I could never quite figure out what the right entry point was, so I never pursued it. I was more of a casual or background Sherlockian. My entree to the more interpersonal Sherlockian world that we all know and enjoy came around 2012 or 2013. I was at a meeting of a group that I chair of another detective fiction character. We call it the Wolfpack, which is the Literary Society for Rex Stout's book. And Peter Krupe, who was a Wolffian, who was also a Sherlockian, a well-known BSI, was the proprietor of a scion called the Montague Street Lodgers of Brooklyn, and invited/ordered me to come to one of his meetings. And so I came to a couple of Montague Street meetings and enjoyed them. Christopher Zordon, another well-known BSI, I think when he saw me there for the second or third time, said, this isn't the only scion, and pointed me to the Sherlockian calendar. And so I started attending meetings of the Priory Scholars here in Manhattan, where I live, and the three Garadebs in Westchester, and the Hudson Valley Scientists, which, of course, is the scion now run primarily by Candy and her husband, Lou Lewis, and some groups in New Jersey. Right around the same time, Ross Davies, who I know has also been on this show, decided to devote an issue of his annual Greenbag Almanac to Sherlock Holmes and asked me to co-edit it with him. And so it was kind of a synergy. The whole world was saying, Ira, you need to be spending much more of your time reading and writing and thinking about Sherlock Holmes. And so I have.
Well, we're glad that you listened. We're all the beneficiaries for both of your involvement. So let's talk a little bit about horse racing and Sherlock Holmes. So I think many people are familiar with Silver Blaze as the leading horse racing story in the Sherlock Holmes canon. Of course, Shoscombe Old Place is another story where horse racing plays a role as well. But maybe you can bring us through, Candy, the history of how the BSI or other Sherlockian organizations have gotten involved with horse racing and what that has meant in years past.
Oh, my, that's a tall order. What I can tell you is that the BSI used to hold horse races in the New York City area. And this was true in the early years. It was particularly popular in the 1950s when Styx was very prominent in the organization. And that got dropped in later years. It became expensive to go to the track, and people began to lose interest to some degree, in that sport. And we began to, if we fast forward quite a number of years, we actually have a whole history of this in our new book. But if we fast forward quite a number of years, we find that Michael Whalen, who is our Wiggins, the head of the BSI, and has been for a little over 20 years until just very recently, He and his wife, Marianne Bradley, had gone to the Saratoga racetrack and had enjoyed it enormously because it's a Victorian track. It's beautifully taken care of. It has marvelous red flowers, red impatiens that they build up in mounds out in front of the old buildings. And they had enjoyed that so much when they had gone with friends that Michael thought it would be a good idea to revive the old tradition of putting on a Silver Blaze race. But he knew that since it was so far from a major population center, it would probably be a good idea to do it less frequently. In other words, not try to do it every single year. So he asked Lou Lewis, my husband, to see what he could do, try and work it up. And so Lou started a triennial Silver Blaze, running of Silver Blaze at the Saratoga track in the year 2000. And that was repeated in 03, 06, and thereafter, each 3 years. I helped him, and in 09, we went to Chicago and joined up with the Chicago group who had been running yearly Silver Blazes at their location. And since we didn't have to do as much work for that, I said, how about we do a book? So we began the tradition of producing a book. And I persuaded somebody else, Roger Donway, who was a local, who at that time lived locally, was a very fine editor and writer, to help with that project. He did not co-edit with that first book, but he co-edited with me on the subsequent 2 books that we did for the next 2. That would be in 12 and 15. And then in 18, we were planning to do this. I'll let Ira pick up the story here.
Yeah, I first attended the Silver Blaze at Saratoga in 2015 and again in 2018. And what happens is that the horse race is on Saturday afternoon, and then on Sunday morning there is a program of talks back in Albany, about 45 minutes from Saratoga. And Candy and Roger had, for the past couple of times, as she said, organized the write-ups, articles based on the talks, into a booklet or a pamphlet, short book that what was it? Saratoga Studies was one of them that was sold and was of great interest to Sherlockians everywhere. Articles about horse racing in the Canon, Silver Blaze, as you mentioned, and Shoscombe Old Place, as you mentioned. And in the summer of, I guess it must have been 2018, another Sherlockian who is well known to listeners to this program, Bob Katz, and I had dinner one night. He invited me to dinner and mentioned to me that he had recently become the co-publisher of the BSI Press, which is the publishing arm of the Baker Street Irregulars, of course, and that this time around, the BSI Press intended to publish a larger book on horse racing in the Sherlockian canon, with not just perhaps 4 or 5 or 6 chapters drawn from the Albany talks after the Saratoga race, but a book of 2 to 3 times that length, to be an even more comprehensive treatment of the of horse racing and all of its aspects to do with Sherlock Holmes or the greater Sherlockian world. And he either asked me or told me, I won't put a verb, that I was going to co-edit this book. He said, "Do you know anything anything about horse racing? I said, nay. But he said, well, you'll edit the book anyway, along with Candy and Roger and so forth. And so I became the third member of the editorial team. And I remember sitting with Bob between courses of our fine Italian meal with a paper napkin. Candy and Roger, of course, had some idea of topics for the book, but Bob and I spent some time thinking about every Sherlockian we knew with an area of expertise that related directly or indirectly to horse racing, and we came up with a number of ideas for people who would be asked to contribute and topics they'd be asked to contribute on, and certainly not all, but many of the chapters in the book traced themselves to that napkin. Of course, others traced themselves to Candy and Roger's expertise and the people they knew. But that was where my involvement came in.
Oh, that's great. So this is all brand new material. It's not it's not a compilation of the previous booklets, then.
No, this is all new, and
it's all new.
And in fact, my understanding is that in general, the BSI Press's policy is
we signed a contract to that effect.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you kept your word. So I want to get through some of these, but why don't we start with each of you, because you each had at least one contribution in the book other than editing. Candy, you talked about something that is near and dear to your own heart and your professional expertise. Why don't you tell us a little bit about art, horse racing, and Holmes?
Okay. Well, for several times now, I have written about art and the canon, and in this particular case, I wrote in a general way about the availability and the pervasiveness of images of horse racing in the world of Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so that was basically my subject. And it's high art and low art, basically. It's not these images could be found in newspapers, prints. They would be on the walls of a men's club. They could be found just about everywhere, and and they could also, of course, be very fine paintings. But the 19th century witnessed an explosion of visual materials as compared with earlier times. If we compare that period with today, we are submerged in visual culture today by comparison with 120 or more years ago. But at that time, they were a world different from what had happened 2 and 3 generations earlier. So that's basically what I talked about in my essay.
That's wonderful. I recently found it was a print of the Nubis ox, and I found it in a link to a story in Atlas Obscura entitled, "In 19th Century Britain, the hottest status symbol was a painting of your cow." Now,
oh, really?
This was
I love paintings of cows, I have to say.
Well, this was around the early 1800s, and the Durham ox was hauled around England and Scotland, and people had portraits taken of the Durham ox, and wealthy British landowners, of course, were breeding animals larger and fatter than ever, so it became kind of a status symbol. It was like taking a picture of your luxury automobile, as it were.
Excellent.
I would imagine, having portraits of horses around, especially if you were involved in the sport in some way, was a bit of a status symbol.
Exactly that. Yes, you're right.
That's wonderful. Well, Ira, you actually brought in your own profession as well in your own contribution here, the law of dogs that do nothing in the nighttime. I didn't realize there was a law to that effect. I certainly know the phrase, but what was your piece all about?
Well, my piece was about the most famous, the best-known story about horse racing in the canon, of course, is Silver Blaze, and the best-known line within that story is of course the dialogue between Holmes and the inspector, where Holmes is asked, "Is there any point to which you would wish to draw my attention?" And Holmes says, "To the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. The dog did nothing in the nighttime. That was the curious incident," remarked Sherlock Holmes. And that line has been used, oddly enough, in a lot of court decisions, both decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court and of lower courts around the world, although I focused on the United States. And what it's used for is the implication that if a certain thing had happened, then someone would have drawn attention to it. And since nobody drew attention to that thing, that thing must not have happened. And this comes up in any context, ranging from burglary cases in which literally the dog didn't bark or nobody wakes up, and therefore the court concludes that it was an inside job, or in more abstruse situations, such as where the court is trying to determine the intent of a statute passed by Congress. And the argument is that by passing certain legislation, Congress made an important change in the law. But when Congress passes a law, there is usually a committee report or some discussion on the floor of the House and Senate in which the bill is discussed. And if no members of the House or Senate, none of the committee staff reference the important change, then the inference is drawn that that change may not have happened. And so what I did, and I tried to do this in straightforward language and not in what we'd call legalese, is survey a number of the court decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court and of lower courts in which reference is made to this type of reasoning. And for several years, there was a split of opinion within the 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court on whether this type of reasoning was valid or not. The late Justice Stevens was a strong proponent of that sort of argument. Justice Scalia did not agree with it. And in fact, I found in Justice Stewart's papers at Yale, while looking for something completely unrelated, some amusing correspondence, which I printed in the book, in which Justice Powell talks about his view on this topic. Well, as of now, it looks like all the current justices subscribe to this theory. They find this to be reasonable. And in fact, in an argument in 2018, there was an argument about whether a large part of a state was really still an Indian reservation, such that it had certain technical implications for the criminal law. And Justice Alito asked the lawyer who was arguing, there's a fundamental principle of law that derives from Sherlock Holmes, which is the dog that didn't bark. So how can it be that none of this was recognized by anyone or asserted by the Creek Indian Nation for 100 years? And that case hasn't been decided yet, so we'll see whether the court cites it. A law professor referred to this argument from the dog that didn't bark, from Congress that didn't say anything. They referred to it as these aphorisms are called canons of construction. And so she refers to it as the Sherlock Holmes canon. And so we've moved from the canon, capital C, to the Sherlock Holmes canon. And that's what I wrote about.
That's wonderful.
That's cool.
Martin Freeman, Nigel Bruce, Edward Hardwick, Jude Law, James Mason, Ralph Richardson, Robert Duvall. The list of actors who've played Dr. Watson is just as rich as those who have donned the deerstalker. Generations have discovered Sherlock Holmes because of the mysteries, but they come back again and again for the characters and for the indispensable Dr. Watson. That's why you will enjoy Anne Margaret Lewis's The Watson Chronicles, a Sherlock Holmes novel in 6 connected stories that begin as Holmes contemplates retirement in 1900. It's a series of baffling mysteries, including one of the biggest of all, Watson's Wives. The Watson Chronicles by Anne Margaret Lewis understands there's always more to learn about Watson. So it's perfect for those of us who believe the noble doctor never gets enough page time. And it's available right now from our WessExpress.com.
As you were assembling the authors whom you hoped would contribute to this volume, and as you were assembling their pieces, how did you go about organizing all of this? Because the book is divided into 4 very discrete sections, and I think it flows very well. How did you begin to think all of this through?
Well,
Are you asking me? I can give you an answer.
I will let you go first, Candy, and then Ira can
Okay,
fill in
this
the
is
gaps.
I can give you a fun answer.
Oh, please.
I left it to Ira.
I like that. I like that. Well, over to you, Ira.
it was left to me. What happened was that we assembled Candy and Roger and Bob and I assembled a list of about 25 people to be invited to submit chapters. 18 said yes, including, as you mentioned, the 3 editors. We waited for the contributions to come in, and then I gave some thought to how to organize them. And as you say, we broke it into four parts, and it seemed to flow relatively logically. And I started at the part that I thought was most central to what people would think of as horse racing in the Sherlockian canon. So part A of the book, which is the first 6 chapters or so, is about racing in the Sherlockian canon. Roger Donway, our co-editor, wrote about the pedigree of Silver Blaze the horse. Christopher Zorden, who is a professional chemist, wrote about how one might, what Silver Blaze the horse might have been painted with or coated with to change his appearance. Marina Stayach, who is a toxicologist, wrote about opium. Candy, as we heard, wrote about art and horse racing and Holmes. Donnie Zalden wrote about some sources that might have inspired Silver Blaze in terms of actual races that occurred in Victorian England, in which attempts were made to tamper with the results. And Charles Prepelak wrote about film adaptations of Silver Blaze, so 6 topics directly related to racing in the canon. We then moved a little broadly from racing in Sherlock Holmes specifically to racing in England more generally. We had an article by Mariel Caro about a day at the races, bookies, booze, women, and horses. Jennifer Neeland, who has an interest in clothing in historical fashions, wrote about what people would wear to the races. And then we moved on to something that's very central, part C of the book, something that's very central to horse racing, both past and present, which is gambling. Gambling in the Sherlockian canon. An article by Francine and Richard Kitts about how gambling runs through the canon. A piece by Charles Blankstein about Watson's betting habit. We know that Watson says at one point in Shoscombe Old Place, I pay for my wagering with about half my wound pension. Does that mean that Watson was a profligate spender, or what does that say about him? And Charles went into that. Relatedly, Monica Schmidt, who is a mental health professional with an expertise in the treatment of addictions, wrote about whether Watson displayed a gambling addiction or not. And Jen Eaker wrote about money lending, which, of course, the need to borrow money either to fund wagers or to pay them off is obviously closely related to gambling. And then we moved in Part D, the final section of the book, into moving outside canonical orbit. Burt Wolder, the distinguished co-host of this podcast, wrote about actual Sherlockians, actual Baker Street Irregulars who influenced the world of sports racing. People like the sports writer Red Smith, or Judge Tupper Bigelow, who codified the rules of horse racing in Ontario. The late Susan Diamond, unfortunately we lost her last year, but Susan and Greg Ruby wrote about the history of Silver Blaze races over the past 20 years. There had been previous coverage of the different Silver Blaze races that have been run in New York City, in Chicago, in Toronto, and elsewhere through the 20th century, and Susan and Greg updated that for the past 20 years. My piece about the law and judges in Sherlock Holmes, and then Clifford Goldfarb wrote about Brigadier Gerard, another memorable character of Arthur Conan Doyle's, who happens to be the namesake of a historically important racehorse in Great Britain. And then Lou Lewis wrote about Dick Francis and Sherlock Holmes, of course, horse racing having an important role in all of Francis's books. And then we concluded with, as most BSI Press books conclude, with suggestions for extensive further reading in the Sherlockian literature related to all the different aspects of horse racing. So Maria and Roger, Maria Fleischik and Roger Donway put that together. And so I guess the approach was from the more central to the more peripheral. But the chapters are all freestanding. You can read them in any order as you wish to dip in, and you'll enjoy them.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's a very comprehensive overview. Thank you for that, Ira. Well, as you were going about this, as the contributions came in, and as you read through them, and I'll start with you, Candy. Were there any surprises that stuck out? I mean, you've done this for a while. You know, you've been involved with the Saratoga races. You've edited 2 other pamphlets with regard to these races. What about these contributions perhaps struck you as different, or something that was interesting that really caught your attention?
Well, that's an interesting question. I did jot down some notes, and it didn't have to do specifically or exclusively with the authors that I worked with necessarily, although some of them I did. But I just thought I would mention a couple of people, because sometimes the essay that's about something hugely specific, that is very, very specific, can end up being one of the ones that you feel like you want to dive into, and becomes very, very interesting. And there are 3 of those that I would mention in this book that are kind of fun to become involved with. And there are more than that, in fact, but I'll just mention them quickly. One is by Monica Schmidt. It's about gambling addiction. Now, I didn't know anything about that. Not really. And it's all in relationship to Dr. Watson. Another is Jennifer Neeland, clothing at Victorian tracks. Well, she describes that in considerable detail, and I find that fascinating. But then I'm interested in clothing, and I watch the Oscars to see the clothing. So this was interesting to me. And Chris Zordon talks about, he's a chemist, and he talks about how you would dye a horse's leg in order to disguise it. And in other words, how it could have been done at the time of the events described in Silver Blaze. And those are just a couple of examples. They're very, very specific. The people who wrote them have very specific expertise, and they aren't the only ones. There are others in our lineup who do also. There are also people who wrote more generally. I, for example, wrote a little bit more generally, although I guess you could say that I do have. I have specialized knowledge too, but there. I found it to be, it was fun to get to know these people and to get to dive into some of their areas of expertise. We also, for me, it was the first time working with BSI Press, and we were able to work with Bob Katz and with John Berquist. And I have worked with John Berquist before, so I was familiar with him. And it was a pleasure to work with both of them.
That's wonderful to hear. Wonderful to hear. Now, Ira, as Candy has enumerated some of these specifics, these very detailed papers that focus on one particular area, as you were doling out the opportunities for authors, were these the very subjects that you wished them to write about, or did you simply leave it open to them?
Most of the time we approach someone with a suggested topic, not so much to try and pigeonhole anyone as to avoid too much overlap in the different chapters. And I think one or two people suggested that they write on slightly different topics or slightly different areas of emphasis from what we had proposed. But I think most of the contributions fell in line, and most of the authors were happy to write about the topics we had suggested. And I was impressed, frankly, by the high quality of the submissions that came in. Interestingly enough, one of the tougher parts of editing the book was choosing the title. The subtitle, which is Horse Racing in the Sherlockian Canon, came to us fairly straightforwardly, but we had a difficult time coming up with the main title. We settled on Upon the Turf, which is a phrase that appears in Silver Blaze, as a consensus title after Candy and Roger loudly shouted down my initial suggestion, which was The Game is a Hoof.
Well, for people who don't know Ira, and he does frequent a few Sherlockian places online, he is known for his puns. So I do note, as I was reading through the book, The Game is a Hoof did make it in there in some fashion, did it not?
I think it's on the. I think it's somewhere in the back cover copy. It was definitely used somewhere, or maybe the introduction. It was definitely used somewhere in the advertising, but not on the cover above Candy and Roger's names.
Well, I applaud you sticking with your brand, Ira, and I think we're all glad that we came out with Upon the Turf. It's a wonderful book. It's red and black, which of course were Silver Blaze's jockey's colors, and the book is it's paperback. It is $25.95, available from the BSI Press at Baker Street Irregulars.com. It clocks in at just a little over 200 pages, and it is worth every single penny. Go on and get yourself a copy of Upon the Turf, Horse Racing and the Sherlockian Canon, edited by Candace Lewis, Ira Matetsky, and Roger Donway. Before we kind of shut things down here, any final thoughts for our listeners, Candy?
Well, you asked if there were any disappointments. I will say there was one thing I was trying to achieve. I wanted one of our authors to be a veterinarian, a specialist in horses, and I tried and tried. I was not successful.
Oh, dear.
I just could not make that happen. But there you are. Sometimes things don't work out.
I understand completely. Ira, how about you? Any final thoughts, disappointments, etc.?
I have to say I really enjoyed contributing to this book, both as an author and an editor. I've been doing a certain amount of Sherlockian writing over the past few years, and this has been a great year in general for Sherlockian publications. don't know whether you'll be having some of the other editors on other shows, but in addition to this book, Terry and Linda Hunt's Aboriginals, which is about the earliest irregulars or proto-irregulars, came out in November. There's a new book on horse racing in the on educators and education in the Professions series. There's a new manuscript series book on Charles Augustus Milverton. There was a biography of Julian Wolff by Sonia Fetherston coming out at the West Point Conference this summer. And over at Wessex Press, Steve Doyle and his team have put out a number of outstanding books. The BSJ has been having an excellent year. There's quite a lot for us to read, and quite a lot of opportunities for those of us who like to write.
Ira, you are like a walking, talking bibliography. I love it.
I don't know if that's a compliment.
Hey, you're talking to bookish people. It's the highest compliment we could give you. And quite frankly, you have just laid out a number of our episodes for the future. So if nothing else, if your career in law doesn't work out, you could become an advanced publicity man for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Good idea. Yeah. And there's silent. I think Ira may have dropped the call after that. May have dropped the phone. Well, thank you, Candy and Ira, for being part of this discussion here and for taking us on the inside of what it was like to participate in editing Upon the Turf. I hope every Sherlockian who may or may not be interested in horse racing takes a look at the book and adds it to their library. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry to have missed that conversation with Ira and Candy.
I know, we missed you too, but, technical difficulties happen, and we do what we can. But since you weren't there, I'd like to turn the focus on you, Burt, and I'd like to hear a little bit about your own contribution to this volume, where you looked at Sherlockians who are involved in the sport of kings. It's titled Off to the Races, Baker Street Irregulars, and the Sport of Kings.
I was asked to investigate that topic, the connection between Baker Street Irregulars and racing, following the particular strategy of finding someone who is completely ignorant about a subject and then sort of putting them in the position where they have to climb out of the pit of their own ignorance. And for the longest while, I was really stuck, because when you look back at the Baker Street Irregulars, obviously, in this subject, you find the people over the years, of course, and they've been well noted, so I don't need to give you the whole list, of people who were involved in Silver Blaze-related activities. And I said to myself, well, there's been a lot written about Silver Blaze. The Baker Street Journal over the years has covered all the races. I was baffled for the longest while and read through all the Baker Street journals, and through part of the attraction of doing something like this, if you're research oriented, and like many of we Sherlockians like these kinds of explorations, are the discoveries. And so my essay about all of this really is a list of the discoveries. It begins with Tom Stix, who of course was influential in restarting the Silver Blaze. But what was interesting to me was I knew or remembered from what I had known in the past very little about Tom Stix's career. And I had forgotten or never knew that what he did professionally was he was an agent for writers and news personalities whom he booked for radio and television appearances. So you have to remember, Tom was very active in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And among his clients was Eleanor Roosevelt, who made the decision, now this is obviously after she was First Lady, to capitalize on her celebrity by appearing in a margarine commercial, which Stix brought to her, and that got her a fee, which she donated to charity. And then he booked her on a Frank Sinatra TV special. And I found out things like that I found really interesting. And then just from going through the Baker Street Journal and looking at this reference and that reference, I discovered a couple of other people whom I had never heard of. So, for example, Alexander Moore Robb was invested as the Addleton Tragedy by Julian Wolff in 1961. And he had written a paper in the Baker Street Journal. But what was interesting about Robb, in addition to the fact that he made arrangements for many of the Silver Blaze races, was his writing. And in one of his essays in the Baker Street Journal, he touched on the topic of fraud and chicanery in racing. And, he wrote at the time that there were, a lot of congressional inquiries at the time into the honesty of racing and so on. But he wrote in this essay, there's nothing new about this. Sometime between 450 and 400 BC, the Athenian politician and general Alcibiades and his cronies bought off a betting coup. It was a 2-chariot race. One driver was a veteran, the other was a neophyte. And Alcibiades and his bully boys loosened the nuts and bolts on the wheel of the favorite's chariot, and they cleaned up, but they were caught and exiled. And, I love the fact that there were people writing for the Baker Street Journal who were, quoting these kinds of things that happened all the way back in the age of the classics. But then I found out that Alexander Moore Robb, who was an irregular, was a manager of the racing interests and the breeding interests of somebody named Willis Sharp Kilmer. And Kilmer was a character who made a fortune promoting his uncle's swamp root patent medicine, which was this kind of quack remedy. And Kilmer was the breeder of the winner of the 1928 Kentucky Derby. So, you find out all these things. And then I also dug into the career of S. Tupper Bigelow, somebody that we've talked about, and his many contributions towards revolutionizing the conduct of racing in Canada and all of his Sherlockian contributions. But then I discovered a lot I didn't know about Red Smith. Red Smith was a famous sports writer, and he had filled a couple of columns with speculation about Holmes's honesty when it came to the turf. But even more interestingly, I found out another irregular, Joe Palmer, whom I had never heard of, was a mate of Red Smith and someone that the Red Smith thought was an even superior writer, who died very suddenly of heart failure in 1952. And he was, according to the research anyway, with Edgar Smith and Tom Sticks Sr., Palmer created the original recording of the Wessex Plate, which was first played at the BSI dinner in 1951. And Palmer received the investiture of Silver Blaze posthumously in 1953. And then at the end of my essay, I got to write a little bit about Tom Sticks Jr., which gave me the opportunity to talk to Dorothy, Tom's widow, Dorothy Sticks, who is living in retirement in Florida, and also her son Stephen. And that was a lot of fun. And the inside story there about that is that although Tom Sticks was very visible, Tom Sticks Jr., very visible in running the Silver Blaze races, the one who did all the work was Dorothy.
Always.
And she gave me some stories. One was they had a bus. They would meet at the Players in New York in Gramercy Park and then go out to the track. And one year the driver went, instead of going to the Players in Gramercy Park, he went to the Playboy Club. And then another year the driver just got lost. And so I had a bunch of stories about that. But it was really charming to find out that so many irregulars had such interesting connections, not only to reviving Silver Blaze and this particular aspect of Sherlockian interest, but also in the racing industry. And I never got to do anything with Henry Lauritsen, which was my great regret, because Henry founded the race in Denmark, and we just ran out of space for a mention of his contributions.
Well, that's fascinating. That sounds like a lot of fun. What wonderful stories came out of that? Well,
that's, for me anyway, that's the value of writing something like this. The little things, the little funny things, the little serendipitous things, the odd contributions, the odd connections. But then, what do you expect? I'm a Sherlockian. I'm goofy anyway.
Yeah. Well, those dulcet tones mean that it's once again time to get ready for everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. That's right, it's Canonical Couplets. We give you a couple of lines of poetry, and you need to identify the Sherlock Holmes story that it's referring to. Now, the last time around, we gave you this clue. Do you ken John Clay in his dark room safely hid? That's a lot more than Jabez Wilson did. Burt, do you know which story that refers to?
Yes, I do. And that's a dead giveaway when you use that word, do you ken John Clay? That's that famous early adventure of Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Scotland.
Oh, gosh, it was right there. It was ripe for the taking, Burt. Yeah. Well, no, you were not even close on this one. No. Although I will say there are a lot of gingers in Scotland as well as Ireland, but this was the Red-Headed League. League, yeah. And we had a lot of new entries this time around. I think folks saw that Baring Gould Christmas annual offering there, and they thought, well, I want to get in on that. So we will then just spin the big prize wheel here and watch it go round and round as it slows down and lands on number 31. 31. And that corresponds to Helena James. Congratulations. We will be in touch and get you your copy of the 2019 BSJ Christmas Annual. And now, it's time for this episode's Canonical Couplet, and we do have another fine prize this time around. We have a limited edition pamphlet, which was distributed to the attendees of the BSI conference at the Lilly Library in November of 2019. It is called Commissionaire, Julian Wolff and His Baker Street Irregulars by Sonia Fetherston. It's a pamphlet that represents part of a publication that is coming out later this year by Sonia. If you didn't attend the conference, this is your only way to get a copy of it. So make sure you get your response in so you can have a chance to win this prize. And the clue is: we gaily watch a wicked man's disease, while Holmes and faithful Watson break the peace. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, jot it down in an email. Send it to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among the correct answers and we select your name at random, you win that prize. Good luck. Yeah, all right. Well, we did promise you some listener mail, and indeed we did get some. And this is a repeat offender. We heard from this individual previously and his newborn son, and he's back for more.
Hello, Jim. It's Antonio from New Jersey, though I'm calling from Dallas on a business trip tonight. It's been some months since I last talked to you. I believe the last time I left a voicemail, my newborn son was in the middle of throwing up on me. Glad to say things have gone relatively easier. But just wanted to call to give you a quick little nod because it definitely came at a wonderful time in my life. I am a analytics guru for a major e-commerce platform, and much of my day-to-day from the work world is producing reports, data points, highlights, nuggets, whatever you want to say. But then for the next 72 hours are poked, prodded, needled, questioned, and, taken down a notch, we'll say. That skepticism sometimes can wear on anyone, really, honestly. And those are one of those days today where bunch of reports I produced were just great, but then also led into a lot of discussion. With that being said, after a long day of that sort of prodding, you come home back to a hotel room and you feel a little questionable about X, Y, and Z, and that's okay. That's part of life. But then I listened to the latest podcast as I started to fall asleep, and I got to the part of Mr. Gould's response to criticism of his efforts. And it was everything that I needed. I sat there laying in bed, listening to us drifting off, and one of them was Mr. Gould's knowledge of Sherlock is immensely deep. Too bad he didn't use it. And that was just a litany of all those, and his way of, digesting that and then spitting it back out was not revelatory, but almost there. My message to y'all was that was great to hear, and I really appreciate the great show and the great effort you guys put through, because on a long day, hearing how someone as experienced as Mr. Gould is to be able to take certain things in stride, and not only take it in stride, but then spit them back out for a few laughs. Very interesting and very inspiring. So thank you guys very much for what you do. As a former Time Inc. employee, it was nice hearing another Time Inc. employee take his criticism, put it in stride, and get a few laughs out of it. While we're both no longer with the company, it was just a nice lineage and something that I truly wanted to hear, needed to hear over a course of a long work day. So thank you guys again, and keep up the great work. Bye.
Well, it's just great. How nice to make that kind of contribution and to keep Bill Baring-Gould's name and attitude alive today and provide a little relief. It means a lot for us, I think, to hear that example, because it's tracks really closely to what my best hopes for doing all this stuff are all about.
Yeah, I remember getting a comment back from the late Peter Calamai, who used to take us with him on long transcontinental commutes or commutes out to the countryside, and who was laid up with, I think, hip or knee surgery at one point, and we were his companions for the time. And I can't tell you how many people tell us that they go to sleep to the sounds of our voice, which I don't know whether to take that as a compliment or as an insult, but it's nice to know that we're there for people in the times that matter.
Yeah, that's very well said. Nice to know we're there for people at the times that matter. It's lovely to remember Peter. I miss Peter.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being part of this program that matters. We couldn't do it without you as a listener. And if you would like to contribute to seeing the show through, we have that nice little orange Patreon button, or, of course, PayPal, where you can take out a subscription, support us on a monthly basis, and show that you care and that what we do matters to you. In the meantime, I remain the all-caring Scott Monty.
And I remain the completely invincible Burt Wolder.
And together, we say, the games of foot.
The games of foot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.
Call recording